Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Episode 3. On the morning of a fine June day, the last of the Earnshaw stock was born, the finest lad that ever breathed. Dr. Kenneth said that Mrs. Earnshaw had consumption, and one night, while leaning on her husband's shoulder, a fit of coughing took her, and she was dead. The child, Hareton, fell wholly into my hands. Mr. Earnshaw, provided he saw him healthy and never heard him cry, was contented. For himself, he grew desperate. He cursed and defied, execrated God and man, and gave himself up to reckless dissipation. The master's bad ways formed a pretty example for Catherine and Heathcliff. His treatment of the latter was enough to make a fiend of a saint. The curate dropped calling, and nobody came near us. Edgar Linton's visits to Miss Cathy were the exception. At 15, she was the queen of the countryside, and a haughty, headstrong creature. Catherine had kept up her acquaintance with the Lintons, and as she had no temptation to show her rough side in their company, she gained the approval of the old lady and the gentleman, the admiration of Isabella, and the heart and soul of her brother. Mr. Edgar seldom mustered courage to visit Wuthering Heights. He had a terror of Earnshaw's reputation, and shrunk from encountering him. One afternoon Mr. Hindley had gone from home, and Heathcliff presumed to give himself a holiday. He had reached the age of 16 then, and without having bad features or being deficient in intellect, he contrived to convey an impression of inward and outward repulsiveness. He had lost the benefit of his early education, and his childhood's sense of superiority instilled into him by the favours of old Mr. Earnshaw was faded away. Catherine and he were constant companions still, but he had ceased to express his fondness for her in words. He came into the house to announce his intention of doing nothing, while I was assisting Miss Cathy to arrange her dress. She, imagining she would have the whole place to herself, had informed Mr. Edgar of her brother's absence, and was then preparing to receive him. "Cathy, why have you that silk frock on?" he said. "Nobody coming here, I hope." "Not that I know of," stammered Miss. "But you should be in the field now, Heathcliff." "I'll not work any more to-day. I'll stay with you." So saying, he lounged to the fire and sat down. "Isabella and Edgar Linton talked of calling this afternoon," said Catherine. "Order Ellen to say you are engaged, Cathy. Don't turn me out for those pitiful, silly friends of yours." "Should I always be sitting with you?" she demanded. "What do you talk about? You might be dumb for anything you say to amuse me." "You never told me before that I talked too little, or that you disliked my company, Cathy." "It's no company at all, when people know nothing and say nothing," she muttered. A horse's feet were heard on the flags, and young Linton entered, his face brilliant with delight. Doubtless Catherine marked the difference between her friends as one came in and the other went out. "I'm not come too soon, am I?" he said, casting a look at me. "No," answered Catherine. "What are you doing there, Nelly?" "My work, miss," I replied. She stepped behind me and whispered crossly, "Take yourself and your dusters off when company are in the house." She, supposing Edgar could not see her, snatched the cloth from my hand and pinched me very spitefully on the arm. I screamed out, "Oh, miss, you have no right to hurt me." "I didn't touch you, you lying creature," she cried, red with rage. "What's that then?" I retorted, showing a decided purple witness to refute her. She stamped her foot and then slapped me on the cheek, a stinging blow that filled both eyes with water. "Catherine, love, Catherine," interposed Linton, greatly shocked at the double falsehood and violence which his idol had committed. Little Hareton, who was sitting near me on the floor, at seeing my tears, commenced crying himself, and sobbed out complaints against wicked Aunt Cathy, which drew her fury onto his unlucky head. She seized his shoulders and shook him. Edgar laid hold of her hands to deliver him. In an instant one was wrung free, and the astonished young man felt it applied over his own ear. He drew back in consternation. I lifted Hareton in my arms and walked off to the kitchen, leaving the door open. The insulted visitor moved to leave the house. "You must not go!" exclaimed Catherine. "Can I stay after you have struck me?" asked Linton. "You've made me afraid and ashamed of you, and you told a deliberate untruth," he said. "I didn't," she cried. "I did nothing deliberately, and now I'll cry myself sick." She dropped down on her knees and set to weeping in serious earnest. Edgar went as far as the court. He possessed the power to depart as much as a cat possesses the power to leave a mouse half killed. He turned, hastened into the house again, and shut the door behind him. When I went in a while after to inform them that Earnshaw had come home rabid drunk, I saw the quarrel had merely effected a closer intimacy and enabled them to forsake the disguise of friendship and confess themselves as lovers. Mr. Hindley's arrival drove Linton speedily to his horse and Catherine to her chamber. He entered, vociferating oaths dreadful to hear, and caught me and Heathcliff in the act of stowing his son away in the kitchen cupboard. Hareton had a terror of encountering either his wild beast's fondness or his madman's rage, for in one he ran a chance of being squeezed and kissed to death, and in the other of being flung into the fire or dashed against the wall. He attempted to touch the child, who, at the first finger his father laid on him, shrieked and struggled as if he would go into convulsions. "You shall not meddle with him," I said. "He hates you. They all hate you. That's the truth." He laughed and said, "Take yourself and him away, and you, Heathcliff, clear you too from my reach and hearing. I wouldn't murder you tonight, unless perhaps I set the house on fire, but that's as my fancy goes." While saying this, he took a bottle of brandy from the dresser and left us. "It's a pity he cannot kill himself with drink," observed Heathcliff, when the door was shut. I sat down in the kitchen to lull my little lamb to sleep. Heathcliff flung himself on a bench by the wall and remained silent. Cathy put her head in and whispered, "Are you alone, Nelly?" "Yes, miss," I replied. "Where's Heathcliff?" she said, coming in. "About his work in the stable," was my answer. He did not contradict me. Perhaps he had fallen into a doze. I perceived a tear or two on Catherine's cheek. "Oh dear," she cried at last, "I'm very unhappy. I want to know what I should do. Today Edgar Linton has asked me to marry him, and I accepted. Nelly, be quick and say whether I was wrong." "You accepted him? Then what good is it discussing the matter? You have pledged your word and cannot retract." "But say whether I should have done so." "There are many things to be considered before that question can be answered properly," I said. "Do you love Mr. Edgar?" "Of course I do," she answered. "You love Mr. Edgar because he is handsome, young, cheerful and rich, and he loves you. But there are several other handsome, young, rich men in the world, handsomer and richer than he is. What should hinder you from loving them?" "If there be any, I've seen none like Edgar." "He won't always be handsome and young, and may not always be rich." "He is now, and I have only to do with the present." "Well, that settles it. If you have only to do with the present, marry Mr. Linton." "I don't want your permission for that. I shall marry him. And yet you have not told me whether I'm right." "Perfectly right. If people be right to marry only for the present. And now let us hear what you are unhappy about. Your brother will be pleased. The old lady and gentleman will not object. You will escape from a disorderly, comfortless home into a wealthy, respectable one. You love Edgar, and Edgar loves you. Where is the obstacle?" "Here and here," replied Catherine, striking one hand on her forehead and the other on her breast. "In my soul and in my heart. I'm convinced I'm wrong." She did not proceed, and instead, taking up another subject, said, "If I were in heaven, Nelly, I should be extremely miserable. I dreamt once that I was there, but it did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping. The angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven, and if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire." Ere this speech ended, I became sensible of Heathcliff's presence. Having noticed a slight movement, I turned my head and saw him steal out noiselessly. He had listened till he heard Catherine say it would degrade her to marry him, and then he stayed to hear no further. "Let me have supper with you and Heathcliff," said Catherine. "I want to be convinced that he has no notion of these things. He does not know what being in love is." "I see no reason that he should not know as well as you," I returned, "and if you are his choice, he'll be the most unfortunate creature that ever was born. As soon as you become Mrs. Linton, he loses friend and love and all. Have you considered how you'll bear the separation, and how he'll bear to be quite deserted in the world?" "He quite deserted? We separated? Who is to separate us, pray?" "Not as long as I live, Ellen. Every Linton on the face of the earth might melt into nothing before I could consent to forsake Heathcliff. He'll be as much to me as he has been all his lifetime. Edgar must shake off his antipathy and tolerate him at least. My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries. My great thought in living is himself. If all else is perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. He's always in my mind. Don't talk of our separation again. It is impracticable." After supper was cooked, I went out and called Heathcliff, but got no answer. On returning, I whispered to Catherine that he had heard a good part of what was said. I told her I saw him quit the kitchen just as she complained of her brother's conduct regarding him. She ran to seek her friend and was absent such a while that Joseph proposed we wait no longer. Then she broke in on us with a hurried command that he must run down the road, find Heathcliff, and make him re-enter directly. Joseph objected at first, but at last he walked, grumbling, forth. Catherine paced up and down, exclaiming, "Oh, I wonder where he is! What did I say, Nelly? I've forgotten. Was he vexed at my bad humour this afternoon? I do wish he'd come." "What a noise for nothing," I cried, though rather uneasy myself, and I departed to renew my search. Its result was disappointment, and Joseph's quest ended in the same. It was a very dark evening for summer. The clouds appeared inclined to thunder. Catherine kept wandering from the door to the road, heedless of the rain that began. She remained calling at intervals, and then listening, and then crying outright. About midnight, the storm came rattling over the heights in full fury. There was a violent wind as well as thunder, but the uproar passed away, leaving us all unharmed except Cathy, who got thoroughly drenched for her obstinacy in refusing to take shelter, and catching much water in her hair and clothes. She came and lay down on the settle, all soaked as she was. "Well, miss," I exclaimed, "come to bed. There is no use waiting any longer on that foolish boy. He'll be gone to Gimmerton, and he'll stay there now." I begged the wilful girl to remove her wet things, left her shivering, and betook myself to bed. Coming down, somewhat later than usual, I saw Miss Catherine still seated near the fireplace. "What ails you, Cathy?" Hindley was saying when I entered. "Oh, she is naughty," I cried, perceiving the master to be tolerably sober. "She got soaked yesterday evening, and here she is. She has sat the night through." Mr. Earnshaw stared at us in surprise. "The night through?" he repeated. "What kept her up?" Neither of us wished to mention Heathcliff's absence. "She's ill," cried Hindley, taking her wrist. "I suppose that's the reason she would not go to bed. What took you in the rain? Tell me, Cathy, were you with Heathcliff last night? Speak the truth now." "I never saw Heathcliff last night," answered Catherine, and she burst into uncontrollable grief. Hindley bade her to get to her room immediately. When we reached her chamber, I thought she was going mad, and I begged Joseph to run for the doctor. As soon as he saw her, he pronounced her dangerously ill. She had a fever, and he told me to take care she did not throw herself downstairs or out of the window. During her illness, old Mrs. Linton paid us several visits, and when Catherine was convalescent, she insisted on conveying her to Thrushcross Grange. But the poor dame had reason to repent of her kindness. She and her husband both took the fever and died within a few days of each other. Our young lady returned to us, naughtier, more passionate, and haughtier than ever. But Edgar Linton was infatuated, and believed himself the happiest man alive on the day he married her, 3 years subsequent to his father's death. Much against my inclination, I was persuaded to leave Wuthering Heights and accompany her here. Little Hareton was nearly 5 years old, and when I refused to go, Catherine went to her brother, who ordered me to pack up. He wanted no woman in the house, he said, now that there was no mistress. I kissed Hareton good-bye, and since then he has been a stranger. I got Miss Catherine and myself to Thrushcross Grange, and she behaved infinitely better than I dared to expect. She seemed almost over-fond of Mr. Linton, and even to his sister she showed plenty of affection. They were both very attentive to her comfort, and who can be ill-natured and bad-tempered when they encounter neither opposition nor indifference? I believe Edgar and Catherine were really in possession of deep and growing happiness. It ended on a mellow evening in September. I was coming from the garden when I heard a voice behind me say, "Nelly, is that you?" It was a deep voice, foreign in tone, and yet it was familiar. I turned and distinguished a tall man dressed in dark clothes with dark face and hair. "You do not know me. Look, I am not a stranger." "What?" I cried. "What? You come back? Is it really you? Is it?"
"Yes, Heathcliff. Where is she, Nelly? You needn't be so disturbed. Is she here? Speak. I want to have one word with her, your mistress. Go and say some person from Gimmerton desires to see her."
"How will she take it?" I exclaimed. "The surprise bewilders me. It will put her out of her head. And you are Heathcliff, but altered."
"Go and carry my message," he interrupted impatiently. "I'm in hell until you do."
When I got to the parlour, both the room and its occupants looked wondrously peaceful. I shrank reluctantly from performing my errand, yet I muttered, "A person from Gimmerton wishes to see you, ma'am." "What does he want?" asked Mrs. Linton. "I did not question him," I answered. She left the room, and Mr. Edgar inquired carelessly who it was. "Someone mistress does not expect," I replied. That Heathcliff, who used to live at Mr. Earnshaw's." "What? The gypsy? The ploughboy?" he cried. "Hush! You must not call him by those names, master," I said. "She'd be sadly grieved to hear you." Ere long, Catherine flew upstairs, breathless and wild. "Oh, Edgar! Edgar, darling! Heathcliff's come back!" "Well, well," cried her husband crossly. "Don't strangle me for that. He never struck me as such a marvellous treasure. There's no need to be frantic." "I know you don't like him," she answered. "Yet, for my sake, you must be friends now. Shall I tell him to come up?" "Here?" he said. "Into the parlour?" "Where else?" she asked. He looked vexed and suggested the kitchen as a more suitable place for him. "No, I cannot sit in the kitchen. Set 2 tables here, Ellen, one for your master and Miss Isabella, being gentry, the other for Heathcliff and myself, being of the lower orders. Will that please you, dear?" "Oh, bid him step up," said Edgar, addressing me, "and Catherine, try to be glad without being absurd. The whole household need not witness the sight of your welcoming a runaway servant as a brother." I ushered Heathcliff into the presence of the master and mistress. He had grown into a tall, athletic, well-formed man. His countenance was much older in expression than Mr. Linton's. It looked intelligent, and retained no marks of former degradation. A half-civilized ferocity lurked yet in the eyes full of black fire, but it was subdued, and his manner was even dignified. My master's surprise equalled mine. He remained for a full minute at a loss how to address the ploughboy, as he had called him. "Sit down, sir," he said at length. "Mrs. Linton would have me give you a cordial reception, and I am grateful when anything occurs to please her." "I also," answered Heathcliff. "I shall stay an hour or 2, willingly." He took a seat opposite Catherine, who kept her gaze fixed on him as if she feared he would vanish were she to remove it. "I shall think it a dream tomorrow," she cried, "that I have seen and touched and spoken to you once more, and yet, cruel Heathcliff, you don't deserve this welcome. To be absent and silent for 3 years, and never to think of me." "A little more than you have thought of me," he murmured. "I heard of your marriage, Cathy, and I meditated this plan, just to have one glimpse of your face, a stare of surprise perhaps, and pretended pleasure. Afterwards, settle my score with Hindley, and then prevent the law by doing execution on myself. Your welcome has put these ideas out of my mind. Nay, you'll not drive me off again. I've fought through a bitter life since I heard your voice, and I struggled only for you." The guest did not stay above an hour, and I asked, as he departed, if he went to Gimmerton. "No, to Wuthering Heights," he answered. "Mr. Earnshaw invited me when I called this morning."